There are some who can live without wild things, and some who cannot. Like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. These words were written by Aldo Leopold as part of the introduction to A Sand County Almanac, a book of essays on nature and the environment. One of these essays, Thinking Like a Mountain, was written on April 1st, 1944, and expresses a profound change in his attitude. I was so inspired by this essay that I wrote a piece for Narrator and Orchestra, which is the subject of this show. Who was Aldo Leopold? Considered to be a pioneer in wilderness management, he graduated from the Yale School of Forestry in 1909. He spent more than a decade with the U.S. Forestry Service in New Mexico and Arizona. Later a professor at the University of Wisconsin, he co-founded the Wilderness Society. His ideas and philosophy form the basis of modern conservation ideals.
Aldo Leopold, I think, left us with a number of legacies, and what the first one is, when you delve into his life, is his poetry. He was, in fact, an incredible ecologist, scientist, naturalist, but he put that all into poetry, and most of us first become aware of it in A Sand County Almanac. We see the poetry of the land. To me, there's a second legacy that is extremely important, and that is a legacy of a life of commitment. He was someone in his lifetime who stretched himself to the maximum. He would look excruciatingly in detail at facts, develop theories, and then ruthlessly, they say, discard them if they didn't fit, if they didn't work. So he was constantly stretching himself in his own thinking. So his lifetime represents not just beautiful poetic words that inspire us. He used every way he could to develop policy of society. He used economics, he used writing, he used lectures, he was a teacher, he was an activist, he created citizens organizations, he was one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. He said, you can't just sit back, but you have to be involved in the thinking of your time, and you have to make a difference. Thinking Like a Mountain is an exquisite part of the Leopold writings, to me, for this reason. It represents his evolutionary thinking in the course of his life and his professional career. Where he started in his forestry career, he was looking at wildlife management, and just think, way back then, there wasn't even such a thing. He was developing it. He was called the father of wildlife management. But what his ideas then entailed were thinking in terms of refuges, of stocking streams, of bringing back extinct species, of creating stock in pens and then releasing them into refuges for people to shoot. And then ultimately he suddenly sees that, no, that's not quite what it's all about. It is finding some kind of a balance here, and the predators are not just to be shot and eliminated and exterminated, but in finding the balance where your deer population is not overrunning the landscape, that there is a place for predators here, because balance is kind of what we're seeking, not just refuges and animals released to shoot, but a bigger picture, sustainability. And that's when he moves to being the father of wildlife management to the prophet of the land ethic. He's saying humankind is there not to take the role of the conqueror and the manipulator, but more to be a mediator, to have a place in it, to be the custodian of all of this. And that is where he says we have to extend our perceptions of man-to-man relationships to human beings into the land and be a part of it. And that is the only way that this civilization is going to endure.
A deep chesty bawl echoes from rimrock to rimrock, rolls down the mountain, and fades into the far blackness of the night. It is an outburst of wild, defiant sorrow and of contempt for all the adversities of the world. Every living thing, and perhaps many a dead one as well, pays heed to that call. To the deer it is a reminder of the way of all flesh. To the pine, a forecast of midnight scuffles and of blood upon the snow. To the coyote, a promise of gleanings to come. To the cowman, a thread of red ink in the bank. to the hunter a challenge of fang against bullet. Yet behind these obvious and immediate hopes and fears, there lies a deeper meaning, known only to the mountain itself. Only the mountain has lived long enough to listen objectively to the howl of a wolf.
Historically, it occupies an important position in the evolution of the book itself, because up until that point, of course, he'd been starting to think about writing these essays as a collection, but he had not yet come to the point where he could see the collection as a whole, or where what was going to happen with it was clear to him. I mean, this is the essay of an older man looking back on an incident in his youth. And he's not simply telling the story, but he's trying to convey in the process who he has become and how he has turned himself into a new person and how his view of the world has changed.
I also think that it's interesting to think about his use of the idea of community. And that is another kind of preservation that I, in the business of being concerned about children, as a head of an advocacy group, more and more people are being concerned about community and what's needed in a community, and the idea that all facets of a community are necessary. And that's what Leopold is talking about, too.
Indeed. Yes, indeed.
So it isn't just interpreted between wolves and deer.
The thing that I noticed about your work is that it is very much filled with the sounds of nature.
You know, I've always loved nature. I think one of the byproducts of living in an urban area is that nature becomes so precious, and the experience of being out in nature is such an intense one. I remember as a small child, I was actually born in Los Angeles, but my parents moved to New York when I was very young. And I remember spending a summer on a farm. And it was one of these revelations that it is so burned into my memory that coming back to New York after that ecstatic summer was extremely difficult, and it made me appreciate all the more nature. And so every opportunity that I have, I get out and I walk and I hike. It's what I love to do almost as much as writing. I would put them almost on a par. And it's very an experience that I find very personally as well as physically refreshing. And I had, Henry David Thoreau has always been a very strong influence on my life. I read him as a teenager, and his Walden Pond was a very strong influence on my life. And I wanted to write a piece on Walden Pond. So I was set to do that when Rupert Cutler, who is the director of Explore Park, said, "Have you considered Aldo Leopold?" Because Leopold is someone who wrote about the problems that we face in the 20th century with the same kind of beauty of language, passionate commitment to what he was writing about, and cadence, almost biblical Shakespearean cadence, that Thoreau had, but more contemporary and more to the point of what we're dealing with today. And I started reading his writings, and I was just so impressed and so overwhelmed that then the difficult issue became, what do I choose of his to write? Because it was like jumping into the ocean. There was so much material. And rather than trying to do little bits and pieces of everything, Kurt Miney and I talked about the possibility of taking only one essay. And since Thinking Like a Mountain is really a seminal essay in Aldo Leopold's life, it was the moment for him, the turning point, where he went from being somebody who used the natural world as a commodity, really, because he liked to hunt deer. From that point of view to realizing that he was part of a whole system that was very interdependent, and once any part of that system was destroyed, it affected everything else. So this piece is like a confession, really, and it was such an important moment for him that it seemed like the right way to begin. So I anticipate this will be the first in many Aldo Leopold projects, because I do find his work so pertinent to our times, and his language and imagery so very beautiful.
There are some who can live without wild things, and some who cannot. Like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them.
For us of the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, and the chance to see a pasque flower is a right as inalienable as free speech.
We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect.
Perhaps such a shift of values can be achieved by reappraising things unnatural, tame, and confined in terms of things natural, wild, and free.